The world woke up to a sentence no one expected to read. Catherine O'Hara is dead. 71 years old. A woman whose face meant comfort, laughter, decades of shared memories. Gone. Just like that. And at first, the story sounded almost gentle. A quiet passing. Natural causes. Family at her side. The kind of ending that feels sad, but neat. But here's the question no one was asking loudly enough. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. What if it wasn't natural at all? Because within hours of her death, something subtle happened behind the scenes. Something the public didn't see. A routine decision that would quietly reopen everything we thought we knew. Doctors requested a full autopsy. Standard procedure, they said. Nothing unusual. Except what they found was anything but standard. Now pause for a second. Think about this. Catherine O'Hara didn't live a reckless life. No known substance abuse, no dangerous medications, no public health scares. So when toxicology results came back flagged, not once, but twice, even seasoned professionals stopped and stared at the screen. What exactly was in her system? At first, lab technicians assumed contamination, a mislabeled sample, a glitch, because the compound showing up didn't belong there. It wasn't part of any prescription. It wasn't over the counter. It wasn't even something most hospitals stocked. And yet, it was there, trace amounts, carefully dosed, almost deliberate. Let that sink in. If this substance wasn't prescribed and it wasn't accidental, then someone had to introduce it, which raises the most uncomfortable question of all. Who had access? The early narrative collapsed fast. Investigators quietly stepped in. Not with flashing lights or dramatic press conferences, just questions. Calm ones, clinical ones, the kind that sound harmless until you realize what they're really asking. Who last saw her? Who managed her medications? Who handled her day-to-day care? And that's when the story shifted from tragic to terrifying, because every answer pointed back to the same place. Her home, her inner circle, the people she trusted most. Here's the contradiction that shook investigators. Publicly, Catherine O'Hara was vibrant, still active, still sharp, still making plans. Well, friends described her as optimistic, engaged, not someone whose body was quietly shutting down. So why did the toxicology suggest prolonged exposure to something she should never have been taking? Even more disturbing, the compound itself was difficult to trace. Not illegal technically, just obscure. Rare, the kind of chemical that doesn't appear in everyday supply chains. The kind you don't stumble upon by accident. So detectives did what they always do when answers don't line up. They followed the paper trail, and that trail didn't lead to a pharmacy. It didn't lead to a doctor. It led somewhere far more personal. Because buried in shipping records, masked under a fake name, investigators discovered purchases that matched the compound found in her body. Ordered quietly, delivered discreetly, paid for in a way designed not to raise alarms. And then came the name tied to that alias. Her son. The realization hit like a punch to the chest. Not a stranger. Not a fan. Not an opportunist. Family. Flesh and blood. Someone who had been there during her final days. Someone no one would ever suspect. Ask yourself this. How many crimes go unnoticed simply because we don't want to believe the people closest to us could be capable of something unthinkable? Investigators didn't rush the arrest. They slowed down. They double-checked everything. Because accusing the child of a beloved icon isn't just explosive, it's irreversible. And yet, the evidence kept stacking up. The compound, the orders, the fake identity, the access. What started as a quiet death was now something else entirely, something darker. And just as detectives prepared to confront him, they uncovered one final detail that would completely change how this story was understood. The arrest didn't happen the way people imagine arrests. No flashing lights, no shouting, no crowd of reporters. It happened quietly, almost politely. By the time detectives knocked on the door, they already knew what they were going to find. The question wasn't whether the evidence existed. It was whether the person on the other side of that door would break or pretend nothing was wrong. Think about that moment for a second. Imagine being told your mother's death isn't being treated as natural anymore. Imagine hearing the word toxicology instead of grief. Imagine realizing investigators aren't looking outward for suspects. They're looking inward, right at you. When they brought Catherine O'Hara's son in for questioning, the room was calm. Too calm. No lawyers shouting. No dramatic denials. Just a man sitting very still, answering very carefully. That alone raised alarms, because innocent people tend to over-explain. Guilty people tend to measure every word. Detectives didn't accuse him outright. They didn't need to. Instead, they asked questions that seemed harmless on the surface. Had he helped manage his mother's medications? Had he ordered supplements or alternative treatments online? Had he ever used a different name for privacy reasons? Each question landed softly, and each answer was incomplete. Here's where things took a turn. When investigators presented the shipping records, packages sent to addresses he had access to, his composure shifted, just slightly. A tightening of the jaw, a pause that lasted a beat too long. And then came the fake identity, same handwriting, same IP address, same delivery patterns. You don't accidentally create a shadow identity that clean. That takes intention, planning, repetition. So detectives pushed harder. Why order a compound no doctor had prescribed? Why use a name that didn't exist? Why hide purchases if there was nothing to hide? His explanation? He claimed he was trying to help. That's the word he kept using. Help. He suggested he'd been researching experimental wellness solutions, that he'd read about alternative compounds that could boost energy, slow aging, improve vitality. He said his mother was curious, open-minded, willing to try unconventional approaches. And for a moment, that explanation almost worked. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Plenty of people experiment with supplements. Plenty of families try things doctors don't officially endorse. That alone doesn't make someone a criminal. But then the contradiction surfaced. The compound found in Catherine O'Hara's system wasn't a supplement. It wasn't sold as wellness. It wasn't marketed to consumers at all. It was a laboratory-grade chemical with strict handling warnings. In other words, this wasn't curiosity. This was risk. Investigators laid that fact on the table and waited. That's when his story changed. Suddenly, he couldn't remember exactly where he'd heard about it. Suddenly, he wasn't sure how often it had been administered. Suddenly, the details blurred. Ask yourself this. If you were truly trying to help someone you love, wouldn't you remember exactly what you gave them? The room went quiet again. And then came the moment that sealed everything. Detectives revealed that the dosage pattern found in her body suggested gradual exposure, small amounts over time, carefully spaced, designed not to trigger immediate symptoms. That detail matters, because accidents don't follow patterns. Intent does. That's when they arrested him. No resistance, no outburst, just silence. A long stare at the table, the sound of handcuffs clicking into place. But here's the twist no one expected. As investigators prepared the case digging deeper into his digital history, they uncovered something even more unsettling. Evidence suggesting this might not have started recently. Messages, searches, draft notes, all pointing to a question that no one was ready to answer yet. Had this been planned long before her final days? And if so, what was the real motive? The deeper investigators dug, the more uncomfortable the questions became. Because this was no longer just about how Catherine O'Hara died. It was about when it really began. At first, detectives assumed the exposure had started shortly before her death. A recent decision, a sudden experiment gone wrong. That would have fit a familiar pattern. Tragic, reckless, but still impulsive. That theory collapsed the moment they opened his search history. Weeks, months, then years. Searches about chemical half-lives, dosage thresholds, detection windows, long-term exposure effects. Not frantic, not panicked, organized, methodical, almost academic. Ask yourself this: who researches something for that long without a plan? Investigators found drafts of notes saved and deleted repeatedly, lists rewritten, wording adjusted, as if someone was trying to think through consequences before acting. Not once, many times. This wasn't curiosity. This was rehearsal. And here's where the emotional weight really hit, because alongside those clinical searches were personal ones. Interviews of his mother, clips of her laughing, articles about her legacy, her wealth, her estate, two very different worlds colliding on the same screen. Joy and calculation. Detectives began to consider a possibility they had been avoiding from the start. What if this wasn't about helping her at all? What if it was about control? People assume motives are always dramatic. Rage, jealousy, hatred. But often, the most dangerous motive is quieter: fear, dependency, the terror of losing relevance, losing access, losing identity. What happens when someone's entire life orbits a star and that star begins to fade? Friends told investigators he had always lived in her shadow. Protective, yes. Devoted, maybe. But also deeply dependent. Financially, emotionally. His world didn't just include her, it revolved around her. And as she aged, that balance shifted. She became more independent again, more private, less reliant. Subtle changes most people wouldn't notice, unless their sense of stability depended on them. Here's the contradiction investigators couldn't ignore. While publicly he presented himself as a caretaker, privately he was searching for ways to manage decline, to slow it, to shape it, to control the outcome. Control is a dangerous word in cases like this, because control doesn't require hatred. It requires justification. And he had plenty. He told himself he was protecting her, preserving her dignity, extending her life. That's how it often starts. Good intentions wrapped around dangerous actions, but good intentions don't explain fake identities. They don't explain hidden shipments. They don't explain chemicals designed to bypass medical oversight. At some point, the line was crossed. The most chilling discovery came from a timeline reconstruction. Investigators matched purchase dates to subtle changes in her health: fatigue, dizziness, moments of confusion that had been brushed off as normal aging. What if they weren't normal at all? What if they were warning signs hiding in plain sight? Family members recalled moments when she seemed frustrated, when she complained about feeling off, but couldn't explain why. When she joked about getting older without knowing someone else was quietly accelerating the process. That realization hit investigators hard. Because if this exposure was intentional, then her final days weren't just tragic. They were manipulated. And here's the part that made even seasoned detectives pause. There was no clear endgame, no sudden payout, no rushed will change, no immediate financial windfall. Which means whatever drove this wasn't about a quick reward. It was about something deeper, something psychological, something unfinished. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors faced a haunting challenge. How do you explain motive when the motive doesn't look like greed or anger, but fear of losing someone and everything they represent? And just as they thought they understood the pattern, a final discovery surfaced in the files. A document time-stamped weeks before her death. A note that suggested he never intended for things to go this far. Or so he claimed. But whether that note was a confession or a contingency plan remained unclear. By the time the case reached the public, the damage was already done. Not just to a family, but to an image millions had trusted for decades. Because now, every clip of Catherine O'Hara laughing carried a shadow. Every interview replayed on television came with an unspoken question hovering beneath it. What was happening off camera? What did she know? And more hauntingly, the prosecution didn't rush their story. They couldn't. This wasn't a case built on a single violent act. It was built on accumulation. Small choices, repeated decisions, a slow drift from care into control. They began where the story truly began, with love. They described a son who wasn't a monster in the traditional sense. No history of violence, no public scandals, no obvious hatred. Instead, someone deeply entangled in his mother's life. Financially, psychologically. That nuance mattered. Because the jury needed to understand how something like this could happen without obvious warning signs. How devotion could morph into possession. How fear could justify actions that logic never would. Experts testified about the compound, how it behaves in the body, how small doses can create cumulative damage, how symptoms mimic aging so convincingly that even doctors might miss it. That detail landed hard, because it reframed everything. Her fatigue, her confusion, her moments of vulnerability. What if those weren't signs of time catching up with her, but signs of someone else interfering with it? Then came the defense. They leaned heavily on intent, on the idea that he never meant to harm her, that he believed he was helping, that his actions were misguided, yes, but not malicious. And for a moment, the room leaned with them, because intent is slippery, especially when wrapped in love. But the prosecution returned to the evidence that refused to bend, the fake identity, the hidden purchases, the secrecy. You don't hide help, you hide guilt. The most powerful moment came not from a document or an expert, but from silence. A recorded interview clip was played in court. Not the words themselves, but the pauses between them. Long, heavy, filled with calculations. When asked if he ever told his mother exactly what he was giving her, he didn't answer right away. That hesitation said more than any confession could, because informed consent matters, especially in love. Without it, care becomes control. And control becomes abuse. As the trial unfolded, public opinion fractured. Some saw him as a villain. Others saw him as a tragic figure who went too far trying to hold on to the only thing anchoring his life. But here's the truth that made this case unforgettable. Both things can exist at the same time. You can love someone and still destroy them. The verdict, when it came, felt oddly quiet. No cheers, no gasps. Just a collective exhale, accountability without celebration. Justice without relief, because no outcome could bring her back, and no sentence could restore the innocence of the memories people once held untouched. In the aftermath, conversations shifted. Families talked more openly about caregiving boundaries. Doctors discussed oversight. People questioned how easily trust can be exploited when we're vulnerable. That may be the only legacy this case leaves behind beyond grief. A warning that danger doesn't always arrive screaming. Sometimes it arrives gently, with a smile, with reassurance, with the promise that it knows what's best for you. So here's the question we end with. How many stories like this never make headlines? How many quiet manipulations go unnoticed because they wear the mask of love? Catherine O'Hara gave the world laughter. But her final story forces us to confront something far less comfortable, that the people closest to us have the greatest power to protect us or to destroy us. And if this case teaches us anything, it's this: we should never stop asking questions, even when the answers scare us, especially then.